So this is now session 6, following on from previous session in which Julie spoke about more detail about how Adida created the images for She Is Mind, and also spoke some to the esoteric significance of his image-making work. And now you'll go on to some other detail of how you participated with beloved Adida at this time.
So I'll read another quote from beloved Adida about She Is Mine that connects to our last recording of the Leela. In She Is Mine, many of the combinative transitions between one non-aptic and the next also involve the gradually emerging transition between black and white, the visual language of the root mind, and color, the visual language of full perception. This combinative procession of bitonal and pantonal non-aptics suggests a fundamental and unbroken unity between the root mind, which sees in black and white, and perceptual mind, which sees in color. So the display of unity, but then also felt in its multiplicity, in the vibrational colors of manifest form in mind, but yes, also then manifestly felt and enacted in relationship to everyone and everything that arises. And this was, again, another way to feel the direct relationship to him and his work with everyone and everything. So I wanted to describe another manner in which I observed and felt this, and he gave me instructions to do so, to observe what was occurring around him in his intimate sphere and with the devotees who were serving him. So from the space of the room, the black and white space of his actually making the images, moving to the sequencing room, and then moving on out into the ashram, out the building that was previously called Great Food Dish, you would enter into an area that was called Seventh Gate. And Seventh Gate is the place where you could enter into Adida's personal and private intimate domain. And this is the place called the Manor of Flowers. There were many entrances that you could go into this space depending upon what your function was in service to him. If you were to walk from Great Food Dish down the steps and then you were to enter onto the lawn of Seventh Gate, which was a bit of a mound and a big grassy knoll of an area that would rise up and go up one direction to your right, all the way up to the sanctuary gates where you would enter into the ashram, or to your left, if you were facing out from Great Food Dish, you would then see the shrine that is Seventh Gate Temple itself. And then right behind that, there would be the gates, large gates that opened into the gardens of the Manor of Flowers. And this is where Adida would walk through on more formal occasions when he would come and go from the sanctuary, or if there was a celebratory occasion where the gates to his sacred intimate domain would be opened, or he would walk to gates that were either on either side at the left or the right. And the ones to the left, the gate to the left, actually went to his private sitting room, which is called the Sukra Kendra. This is a place that was made use of by him and only him, and there were many different devotees who were trained as priests to be able to serve in these Sukra Kendras, they were the ones who were real priests of his person and his sacred purposes, and they would be in his sphere at times just to make sure that it was cleaned, and he'd ask for things to be placed in there. And I did that myself many times and was taught how to serve in that temple. Many men would go in there to do services and to make sure that his seat and the room and the space and the temple itself was being cared for properly, and remain sanctified in terms of the actual practical necessities in this grosser domain. So he would go into the Sukra Kendra sometime through that gate, or if he would go all the way around to the right across the knoll and the grass and past the seventh gate temple, he would walk down a path that would go through a gate where he would enter into his space of the Manor of Flowers through an entry room, and he would then just go into his home. And that home, his home, was a temple. It was the temple, in addition to the Sukra Kendra, that was the most profound space where he lived and breathed and bathed and ate and spent time with his intimates and with his animals, and devotees would come in there. And it was beautiful to see his dance through these spaces, through these sacred spaces on the temple grounds and at his home. So and oftentimes in service to him, and when he was working with us directly, we would walk with him, attending to him. Men would walk with him, attending to him. We would be carrying things that he might need us to carry. And then also, if there was family visiting him, or if the Gurukula was there, they would walk with him, and he'd be engaged in interactions, or sometimes he would be really quiet. His walking pace would be different at times, and his placing of his staff would be different. Sometimes he'd be so focused that he wouldn't be looking to the left or the right or up and down. Sometimes he'd be looking all over, and he'd be interacting and conversing. And it was just a beautiful vision to see him as he moved about his sanctuary, the retreat space that was given to him by devotees. So again, in this observation, I would see and observe that even though he was looking through a camera as he was shooting the images themselves would be a view as one who recognizes reality itself as not an independent object or other, individuated, out of the context of the interconnectedness and the prior unity. This is how he flowed, and this is how he moved, and in sensitivity to him and recognition, devotional recognition. If we were in his space with him, as he would characterize rightly and most auspiciously, we would move as priests and priestesses in sensitivity to this flow of his bright being, to his presence, to the feeling of his being. And yet at times also, because of our level of maturity or immaturity or preparedness or adaptation or whatever process that each individual devotee was involved in, he was always required at various times to address and continue to instruct at different levels of the being as it manifested as a form of mind, actually physically manifested. And so when I would go into his intimate domain, always he was there with his Gurukula most often, and they were there at this time. And even though one thing I noticed that was different with those who were spent most of their time in his intimate sphere, the dynamics had changed a bit. And those of us, and the Gurukula included, in the earlier years, many who came around him and many people since then always hoped that we would never have to leave, and maybe sometimes we felt like we really wanted to leave because it got too intense. And there was the whole spectrum of emotional responses and observations of patterning and psychobiographies of the egos that were being transcended in his company. the degree to which one was capable of doing that and engaging that process for real, these individuals, including his daughters and those who were acknowledged as being responsible at a certain level of capability for being in an order that was defined around him at any given time, I had noticed something that had changed significantly. And one was that many of the people that I was familiar with that had been so close to him were dispersed all over the place, were all over the globe, and even his daughters were no longer living intimately and directly with him, even though they had most of their life been in his sphere. Even though they would be in the ashram, they would always come back into his home every day for significant or brief periods of time. So at this time, I noticed that the daughters had begun to play different roles and go through their own unique process of growing, and even just in human life terms, and in relationship to him, and in service to him, and in service to devotees and the world. This was also true of men and women who had otherwise seemed to me, if they weren't there in the house, that it seemed a bit odd to me. And then there were new people there that I wasn't as intimate with. And so it was always an influx and an outflow of this reciprocal and integrative and yet dispersing and then drawing back in of whoever was necessary to coincide with the work that he was doing.
So just a quick question. When you refer to the Gurukula in his house, I presume you're talking about those most intimately associated with him, daughters, kanyas, and then also the intimate service. That's what you're referring to.
Yes, at this time, the women who were around him, I believe, were characterized as quandrami, and then there were also the Gurukula daughters and their intimates. They had intimate partners that would come in and out and were assumed as in the intimate sphere, and they would also, the men would then also assume a direct service to Adida in some form. And then there were, with any of them, they all had friends, intimate devotee friends, who also had certain services in relationship to Adida, and they would come in and out of the house. And the two quandrami who were there at that time was Sukapur and Nadikanta, and there were other ladies who were also assuming a more bodily role of service to him. And not just women served him bodily, there was also the medical and healing practitioners who would come into his intimate sphere. And for extended periods of time, there were certain ones that were always coming in and out on a daily basis to attend to him and his well-being.
And so in terms of Adida specifically asking you to observe the dynamics around him, did he also ask you to speak to him about this, or did you report back to him about what you're observing?
I did at some times, and also through other ladies who had the responsibility to communicate to him about cultural matters or matters of practice in relationship to those who were serving around him. And this was a specific thing he said to me to observe, but then also this observation was something that we all did with one another. That was a constant consideration, a reality consideration in the profoundest sense of the terms, about the nature of our process and practice with him.
So what kind of observations did you reflect back to Adida and discuss or consider with him? Was there anything that you recall?
Well, yes. And this occurred in the context of a gift that I gave him when I first arrived. And this is probably close to the time of the sequence of this. And I had brought a gift to him that had pages of sacred elements that were passed out as prasad over the years, beginning with the time that we began to do what was called sacramental service, or ceremonial and ritual puja, or practices that the secondary practices, ceremonial or otherwise, fire pujas, Paduka pujas, Shadana pujas, Murti pujas, establishing the temples and the sacred spaces and grounds around the sanctuary.
You mean like the ash packets were in the album? Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Ash packets, kumkum packets, little descriptions of holy waters that have been either from the washing of his feet or the washing of the padukas, or from Holy Cap Grotto, the sacred waters on the land.
Flower petals from the pujas.
Flower petals, yes, yes. Ash from the fires.
So this album contained these sacred items going back from the 70s all the way through to the 90s and into the 2000s. It was quite a history.
Well, not as early as the 70s, early the 80s, from the 80s, because even though many of these kind of traditionally ceremonial aspects were from a lot of different traditions, were kind of interspersed or experimented with or studied or considered from the great tradition as a whole, at a certain point in time, there was the establishment of the priesthood and the sacred services, sacramental services, and we began to create what was unique to Adida's bright intervention and his manifest divine purposes. So I brought this as a gift to him, and I displayed them in a chronological order in time relative to these different elements. And so when we sat on the bed and we were looking through this, I was communicating to him about what I was observing, is how much change has occurred throughout time around him and the different individuals that participated in him in the development of the sacred nature of his sanctuaries and the priesthood and the direct relationship to him. And that it was the fullness of what had manifested at the Mountain of Attention. I praised him for all of this and the sacred temples and the uniqueness of the sacred temples and what it was like, learning about the pujas and becoming a priestess in relationship to him. And a lot of the time as we sat there on his bed, looking in his bedroom in the manner of flowers, as he was flipping through this and touching, every single one of them, and a couple of them, taking them out and looking at them. And many of the early ash packets were actually handwritten. There was nothing, we didn't have a printing process that occurred as in later times and as it is done now, but these were all created, and sometimes even created as he sat there with us, where in the earlier days when the sacred and sacramental services and priesthood was established, there was a larger group of people who lived with him, men and women, intimately, day in and day out. And so the consideration of the establishment of all the temples, say on the Mountain of Attention, were done in direct relationship to him on his body. He actually taught us and established these sites directly himself, with us assisting him. We didn't create any of these sites independent of him. These were his sites.
I remember looking at the ash packets, and if I remember correctly, many years ago, there weren't Murti images for a period of time of Adida's bodily human form, but the Murti images were of sacred signs, and some of those ash packets were represented, and they were hand-drawn and hand-painted. Each one was a unique art piece.
Exactly. And it took a lot of devotees to create each ash packet. It wasn't just a printed one. It was an artistic guild that actually put those packets together. And it was beautiful. So when we were looking through this, I suddenly noticed that, as I often did around him, and again, the effulgence of his bright being magnified in the room, and then a unique kind of a aspect of his being would manifest as what I would describe, and he speaks about as the wound of the heart or brokenheartedness. And this isn't a negative thing. This is just an aspect of reality, that nothing is permanent. Shift, change, shift, change, and the necessity of the rotation of things within and out his sphere, intimates coming and going, elements coming and going. And what he, as I felt into when he was looking at this, I could again see that there was a well of emotion in his being. And we were commenting on the fact that, and noting the fact that how many individuals intimately around him was required to even create one ash packet, as you were describing, or the creation of the holy sites. And so he turned to me and he said very gently, "We actually did have a sacred culture in the past, didn't we?"